The biggest victims of the 2008 financial meltdown weren't Wall Street bankers. They were average working class Americans. And while the top 1% have rebounded from their meager losses in the 6 years since the financial collapse, the middle class is still struggling and they're still being scammed by big banks. Joining me to discuss one of the latest scams that's harming working class Americans is attorney Matthew Edling. Matt, private equity companies, corporations, whatever you want to call them, banks, I guess, would be the overall generic term that covers it. You know, it seems that they always come back and they prey upon the middle class. Take just a second, kind of explain what this private equity is and what's happening right now.
Sure, Farron. I think that private equity firms as a whole, the way they work is, well, they will target companies, ideally for them, vulnerable companies. And their business model is pretty simple. They seek to acquire a controlling share in the company with a lot of debt, meaning the private equity firms will load those companies up with a lot of debt. What this allows the private equity firms to do is to have a lower tax rate for themselves by utilizing that debt. And unfortunately for that company, it has now become what was probably already a vulnerable company, a much more risky company because it's loaded with debt. What we see for the average consumer is, obviously, there are a lot of companies in this country whose services or goods go to you and I and the average consumer. And when you have a company that is larded with debt and then becomes a takeover target, either A, the cost of the goods that we have to buy will go up, or B, the cost of those goods will go up because all of a sudden the companies that used to provide us those services and goods are no longer in business anymore because those private equity firms just took them over.
And then we have this recent report that came out from the government that said, oh my goodness, almost half of the activities taking place within these private equity firms are just riddled with fraud and seemingly illegal activities. I mean, what's going on other than the, scamming businesses, taking over, loading them with debt and selling them off for a profit? What else is happening beyond that?
So I think what we're seeing now is something that has always been there. But since the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, there is now, for the first time, theoretically, governmental oversight and inquiry into what are typically pretty opaque dealings in these private equity firms, such that they are looking at the internal controls of the company, which, I think a lot of people hear the words internal controls and perhaps it just whistles right over their heads or their eyes gloss over, but what it means is a pretty simple thing, which is, what is the management doing to improve or not improve not only that private equity firm, but the actual target that they are supposed to be helping, right? Because the notion is, and this is what is advanced by private equity firms, and they're not all terrible, right? But the notion is, hey, we are here to help these companies that are suffering. The problem that I see and that you see and that the government now sees is what is actually happening in a lot of these firms is not what they're representing. They're coming in, they're not only larding the company with debt, but they have huge management and monitoring fees that go part and parcel with the debt that they lard on these companies, such that these companies who need, in all likelihood, assistance in helping them with their business model and creating a better and more serviceable good for their consumer, are now faced with, well, we're riskier because of more debt. We have to pay the private equity firm a lot of money, and I guarantee you that those private equity firms now dominate the board of those companies.
And, Mitt Romney was in the private equity business at Bain Capital, and he and Bain became the poster child of private equity gone wrong. But as you also pointed out, though, these are not all bad companies. And you've got at least half of them that the government has looked at that said, you know what, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're coming in, the business might be failing, might be underwater. You're giving them money, helping them so they can be bought out and paid off. They're not shutting their doors. They're staying open under new management. Whereas Mitt Romney would come in, they'd snatch it up for low, lay everybody off, probably rip the copper out of the wall, sell that for a profit, and get the hell out of there. But the big problem that we have with these private equity firms today that are involved in this fraud is the fact that we have so much of public and private pension money in those firms, and now we're seeing people lose money again through this private equity scam. Is that correct?
Right. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, these private equity firms will charge fees, management fees, monitoring fees, transaction fees. And when you tie the fact that these private equity firms by definition are very opaque, that our public entities don't really have a firm grasp, or never have historically, on what the fees are that these private equity firms are charging. And what the government's inquiry has seemingly discovered is that a lot of private equity firms are charging egregious fees for services that, one, are either unnecessary or not offered, and most importantly, that those fees, because it's such a large amount of money invested, are billions and billions of dollars that should have been returned to those public funds as investment capital, and thus benefiting the 401ks and the retirement plans of our teachers and public officials.
Okay, so now we've got about a minute left. The government knows about this. They know the problem's there. They could fix it. But in your opinion, and I understand you may be a little biased towards this, do you think it's going to come from government action or from private litigation, from attorneys filing suits? Where's the change going to come from?
I am a little biased. I'll say ideally both, but I would bank on the latter more than the former, and here's why. Where an average person would say, well, Elizabeth Warren says that we shouldn't be larded with enormous amounts of student loan debt, and that the rich should pay the same tax rate as the middle class. That makes sense. Except you have someone like Mitch McConnell that says, well, that's not actually so. If you can't afford to go to Harvard, you shouldn't go there. That's a very different and very dichotomous point of view that I don't see us overcoming in government anytime too soon. So I think, just based upon that alone, you're going to see, if this problem is going to be ameliorated, it's going to have to come from, well, people like you and me.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for everything you do, and thanks for joining us today to talk about this story.